When Samuel Winterwolf Henderson gave his last wool blanket to a shivering Lakota child on the coldest night in Dakota Territory history, he had no idea that single act of compassion would save not only his own life, but transform an entire region torn apart by decades of mistrust and violence. But sometimes the smallest gestures of kindness can bridge the deepest divides, and sometimes what we give away in our darkest hour comes back to us, multiplied beyond anything we could have imagined. Samuel Henderson had earned his unusual nickname during the brutal winter of 1876, when he had survived alone in the Badlands for 3 months after a Sioux war party had attacked his wagon train and left him for dead. The Lakota warriors who found him weeks later, half frozen and delirious from hunger, had been so impressed by his resilience and his respectful attitude toward their people that they had dubbed him Winter Wolf before helping him find his way back to civilization. Unlike most white settlers in the Dakota Territory, Sam had learned to speak basic Lakota during his time with the tribe, and he had developed a deep respect for Native American culture that put him at odds with many of his neighbors. He understood that the conflicts between settlers and tribes were more complex than the simple good versus evil narrative that most white communities preferred, and he had spent years trying to build bridges between cultures that seemed determined to destroy each other. Sam's ranch sat in a remote valley about 30 miles northwest of Deadwood, on land that had been considered worthless by most settlers because of its harsh climate and distance from established trading routes. But Sam had seen potential where others saw only hardship, and over the course of 8 years, he had built a modest but successful operation raising hardy cattle that could survive the brutal Dakota winters. The ranch had been his sanctuary after losing his wife Elizabeth and their infant son to diphtheria in 1878, a tragedy that had nearly broken his spirit completely. Elizabeth had been his anchor, the one person who truly understood his complicated relationship with the frontier and his belief that white settlers and Native Americans could coexist peacefully. After her death, Sam had retreated to his isolated ranch and focused on the simple rhythms of raising cattle and surviving each harsh season as it came. By December of 1881, Sam was facing the worst crisis of his ranching career. An early blizzard had killed nearly half his herd, and a late payment from his cattle buyer had left him without enough money to buy the supplies he needed to survive the winter. His food stores were dangerously low, his firewood was running out, and he was beginning to face the very real possibility that he might not live to see spring. The situation had become so desperate that Sam had been forced to make hard choices about which possessions to burn for fuel and which supplies to ration so severely that he was slowly starving. He had already burned most of his furniture, several books that had been precious to him, and even some of Elizabeth's belongings that he had been saving as mementos. Each item he fed to the fire felt like another piece of his old life disappearing forever. Most heartbreaking of all, Sam had been forced to slaughter his last milk cow for food, knowing that doing so eliminated his only source of fresh protein for the rest of the winter. He had also been rationing his remaining cattle feed so strictly that his surviving animals were growing weaker by the day, making it unlikely that they would survive long enough to be sold in the spring, even if he managed to live that long himself. The storm that changed everything began on December 21st, the longest night of the year, with winds that screamed down from Canada, carrying snow so thick and cold that it seemed to freeze the air itself. This wasn't just another winter storm, but a weather event so severe that it would later be remembered throughout the territory as the White Death, a blizzard that killed hundreds of people and thousands of animals across the northern plains. Sam had spent the day preparing for the storm as best he could, with his limited resources, bringing his surviving cattle into whatever shelter he could provide, and securing his buildings against winds that were already strong enough to knock a man off his feet. As night fell and the storm intensified, he found himself trapped in his cabin with barely enough firewood to last until morning and only one wool blanket left to keep himself warm. The blanket had been a wedding gift from Elizabeth's mother, hand-woven from the finest wool and dyed a deep blue that had reminded Elizabeth of summer skies. It was the last possession Sam owned that carried genuine sentimental value, and he had been saving it as his final defense against the cold that was slowly killing him. Wrapped in that blanket, sitting beside a fire that was burning the last of his furniture, Sam was facing what he believed might be his final night alive. The sound that interrupted his grim meditation came around midnight, barely audible over the howling wind, but unmistakably human. Someone was outside his cabin, and from the weak, irregular nature of the noise, it was clear that whoever it was needed help desperately. Sam opened his door to find a small figure collapsed in the snow, just a few feet from his porch, nearly buried by the accumulating drifts. It was a Native American child, a girl who couldn't have been more than 8 or 9 years old, dressed in traditional Lakota clothing that was completely inadequate for the killing cold of the blizzard. She was unconscious and barely breathing, her lips blue with hypothermia, and her small body shaking with convulsions that indicated she was very close to death from exposure. Without hesitation, Sam carried the child into his cabin and began the careful process of warming her gradually, while trying to determine how she had come to be alone in such terrible conditions. As her body temperature slowly returned to normal and she regained consciousness, the girl began speaking in rapid Lakota, words that Sam could partially understand, but that clearly conveyed terror and desperate concern for someone else. From what Sam could gather, the girl's name was Little Star, and she had become separated from her family during the storm. She kept pointing toward the door and repeating words that Sam recognized as referring to her grandmother, indicating that there was another person somewhere in the blizzard who needed help. But the storm outside was so severe that venturing into it would be suicide for anyone, let alone a weakened man with limited cold weather gear. As Little Star gradually warmed up and became more coherent, Sam was able to piece together more of her story. Her family was part of a small band of Lakota who had been traveling to the Pine Ridge Reservation when the storm caught them in the open. Their group had been forced to take shelter wherever they could find it, and in the confusion, Little Star and her elderly grandmother had become separated from the main party. The grandmother, who was too old and frail to travel far in such conditions, had apparently told Little Star to seek help while she tried to find shelter on her own. The child had been walking through the storm for hours, following what she hoped was the direction of smoke from Sam's chimney, before finally collapsing just outside his door. Sam faced an agonizing decision. He could keep Little Star warm and safe in his cabin, but doing so meant accepting that her grandmother would almost certainly die in the storm, or he could attempt a rescue mission that would probably result in all 3 of them freezing to death in the wilderness. With his limited supplies and weakened condition, Sam wasn't sure he had the strength to save anyone, including himself. But as he looked at Little Star's face, seeing the trust and hope in her dark eyes, Sam realized that he couldn't live with himself if he didn't try to help. The child had risked her life to seek assistance for someone she loved, and her courage deserved better than abandonment from the only person in a position to help. The problem was that Sam had only one blanket left, the precious wool blanket that was all that stood between him and death from hypothermia. If he wrapped Little Star in it and ventured into the storm to search for her grandmother, he would be exposing himself to temperatures that would kill him within minutes. But if he kept the blanket for himself, the child would likely die from exposure before morning. Sam looked at the blue wool blanket, remembering Elizabeth's face when her mother had presented it to them on their wedding day, remembering all the cold nights when it had kept both of them warm, remembering how Elizabeth had wrapped their infant son in it during his brief life. It was the last tangible connection he had to the happiness he had once known, and giving it away felt like losing his family all over again. But then Little Star spoke again, her voice weak but determined as she tried to explain that her grandmother had been carrying medicine for other members of their band who were sick with fever. If the old woman died, she said, others would die too, and Little Star would carry that knowledge for the rest of her life. In that moment, Sam understood that this was about more than just saving 2 lives. This was about choosing between despair and hope, between isolation and connection, between the past that was gone forever and a future that might still hold meaning. Elizabeth had always believed that people were meant to help each other regardless of their differences, and Sam knew that she would want him to make the choice that honored that belief. Without saying a word, Sam wrapped Little Star in the blue wool blanket, making sure it covered her completely and would retain her body heat even if he wasn't there to tend the fire. Then he put on every piece of clothing he owned, grabbed a rope and a lantern, and prepared to venture into the storm that would probably kill him. "I'm going to find your grandmother," he told Little Star in his halting Lakota. "Stay here by the fire, and if I don't come back by morning, wait until the storm stops and then walk toward the sunrise until you find help." The search for Little Star's grandmother was the most difficult thing Sam had ever attempted. The storm was so severe that he could barely see his own feet, and the wind was strong enough to knock him down repeatedly. He used the rope to maintain a connection to his cabin, moving in gradually expanding circles while calling out in both English and Lakota, hoping to hear some response over the howling wind. After what felt like hours but was probably only 30 minutes, Sam was on the verge of giving up when he heard a faint voice responding to his calls. Following the sound through snow that was sometimes waist-deep, he found Little Star's grandmother huddled behind a fallen tree about a quarter-mile from his cabin. She was barely conscious and clearly close to death, but she was alive. Getting the elderly woman back to the cabin required every ounce of strength Sam possessed. She couldn't walk on her own, and carrying her through the deep snow while fighting winds that seemed determined to blow them both off, course tested the limits of his endurance. By the time he managed to get both her and himself back to his door, Sam was so exhausted and cold that he could barely function. Inside the cabin, Sam faced another crisis. He now had two people who needed warmth and care, but he had given away his only blanket and burned most of his fuel. The fire was dying, and he had nothing left to feed it except the cabin's wooden walls themselves. In desperation, he began pulling boards from the interior walls, feeding them to the flames to maintain enough heat to keep his guests alive. Little Star's grandmother, who introduced herself as Singing Bird, was suffering from more than just exposure. She had been sick with pneumonia for several days before the storm, and the stress of the ordeal had weakened her further. Sam spent the rest of the night trying to keep her breathing stable, while monitoring Little Star for signs of relapse into hypothermia. As dawn finally broke and the storm began to subside, Sam realized that he had probably saved 2 lives, but at the cost of his own survival. He had no fuel left, no food, and no blanket to protect himself from the cold. The cabin was now partially destroyed from his efforts to find burning material, and even if the weather improved, he was in no condition to make the long journey to town for supplies. But around midday, as Sam was beginning to accept that he might have delayed rather than prevented his own death, he heard sounds outside that seemed impossible, given the circumstances. Voices were calling in Lakota, and horses were moving through the snow around his cabin. When he looked outside, Sam saw something that took his breath away. A party of about 30 Lakota warriors and their families were approaching his cabin, led by a man Sam recognized as Chief Ironhawk, one of the most respected leaders in the region. They were pulling travois loaded with supplies and driving a small herd of horses, moving with the purposeful efficiency of people who knew exactly what they were doing and why they were doing it. Chief Ironhawk dismounted and approached Sam's door with the formal dignity that marked all his interactions with white settlers. "Winter Wolf," he said in English that was heavily accented but perfectly clear, "we have come to repay a debt that cannot be measured in any currency that white men understand." Sam learned that Singing Bird was Chief Ironhawk's mother-in-law, the most respected medicine woman in their band, and the keeper of knowledge that was essential to their people's survival. When the storm had scattered their traveling party, warriors had been searching for her and Little Star, but the blizzard had made tracking impossible. They had been preparing to mourn both of them as lost when Little Star had managed to make her way back to the main group just hours earlier, wrapped in a blue wool blanket and carrying a message about the white rancher who had saved them both. But more than just gratitude for saving 2 lives, the Lakota had come because Singing Bird had told them something that had astonished the entire band. She had explained how Sam had given away his last blanket and risked his own life for people he barely knew, demonstrating the kind of selfless courage that Lakota culture valued above all other virtues. "My people have been watching you for years, Winter Wolf," Chief Ironhawk explained. "We know that you are different from other white men, that you treat our people with respect and try to understand our ways. But what you did last night proved that you have the heart of a true warrior, and warriors take care of each other regardless of the color of their skin." What followed was unlike anything Sam had ever experienced. The Lakota families began working with organized efficiency to restore and improve his ranch in ways that went far beyond simple repayment for his kindness. They brought lumber to repair his cabin and make it warmer and more comfortable than it had been before the storm. They brought food, blankets, and other supplies that would ensure his survival through the rest of the winter. Most importantly, they brought cattle to replace the animals he had lost to the storm and the harsh economic conditions that had nearly ruined him. These weren't charity gifts, but carefully chosen livestock that would form the foundation of a more sustainable and profitable ranching operation. The Lakota had been observing the local cattle market for years, and they understood which animals would thrive in the local climate and command the best prices from buyers. But the most significant gift was the knowledge they shared about surviving and thriving in the harsh Dakota environment. Singing Bird, despite her recent illness, spent hours teaching Sam traditional techniques for preserving food, predicting weather patterns, and treating both human and animal ailments with native plants and herbs. Warriors shared their understanding of the local geography, showing Sam water sources he had never known about and grazing areas that could support more cattle than he had ever imagined possible. As the days passed and Sam's ranch was transformed, he found himself becoming part of a community that transcended racial and cultural boundaries. The Lakota families who had come to help him began stopping by regularly, creating relationships that were based on mutual respect and genuine friendship, rather than the suspicious tolerance that characterized most interactions between whites and Native Americans in the territory. Little Star, who had recovered completely from her ordeal, became a regular visitor to Sam's ranch, often accompanying her grandmother on her medical rounds throughout the region. The child had been profoundly affected by Sam's willingness to risk his life for her family, and she seemed to view him as a kind of honorary uncle who could be trusted with the most precious secrets of her people. Through these relationships, Sam learned that the Lakota community had been facing many of the same challenges that had nearly destroyed his ranch. Government policies had disrupted their traditional ways of life, making it difficult for them to support themselves through hunting and gathering. Many families were struggling to adapt to reservation life while maintaining their cultural identity and caring for their elders and children. Sam realized that his ranch could serve as more than just a cattle operation. Its location between traditional Lakota territory and white settlements made it a natural meeting place where both communities could trade goods and knowledge without the tensions that usually marked such interactions. He began hosting informal markets where Lakota families could trade traditional crafts and medicines for manufactured goods and cattle products. These gatherings grew larger and more significant over time, eventually becoming formal trade fairs that attracted participants from across the northern plains. Sam's ranch became known throughout the territory as a place where different cultures could meet safely and peacefully, where disputes could be resolved through discussion rather than violence, and where the artificial barriers between communities could be temporarily set aside in favor of mutual benefit. The transformation of Sam's personal circumstances was equally dramatic. Within a year of that terrible night when he had given away his last blanket, his ranch had become one of the most successful operations in the Dakota Territory. But more importantly, he had found a sense of purpose and community that had been missing from his life since Elizabeth's death. The blue wool blanket that had started it all was returned to Sam in a ceremony that honored both his sacrifice and the bonds that had grown from it. Singing Bird had carefully repaired the blanket where it had been damaged during Little Star's ordeal, and she had added traditional Lakota decorations that told the story of what had happened that night. It became a symbol of the friendship between communities and was displayed prominently in Sam's cabin as a reminder of what could be accomplished when people chose compassion over fear. Sam never married again, but he was never truly alone. Little Star grew up considering him a member of her extended family, and she eventually married a young warrior who became one of Sam's closest friends and business partners. Singing Bird lived for another 15 years, during which she and Sam collaborated on documenting traditional Lakota medical knowledge in ways that could be shared with white doctors who were interested in learning from Native American healing practices. Chief Ironhawk became not just an ally, but a genuine friend, someone Sam could trust with his life and whose counsel he sought on matters ranging from cattle breeding to territorial politics. Together, they worked to prevent several conflicts between white settlers and Lakota communities, using Sam's ranch as neutral ground where grievances could be aired and solutions could be found without bloodshed. The success of their friendship had broader implications for the entire region. Other white settlers began following Sam's example, seeking to build relationships with Native American communities based on mutual respect rather than fear and suspicion. Similarly, some Lakota leaders pointed to Chief Ironhawk's friendship with Winter Wolf as proof that cooperation with whites was possible without sacrificing cultural integrity. When Sam died in 1903 at the age of 68, his funeral was attended by more than 400 people, representing every community in the Northern Plains. Chief Ironhawk, now an old man himself, delivered a eulogy that was conducted in both Lakota and English, honoring Sam as a bridge between worlds and the example of what could be accomplished when people chose understanding over hatred. The ranch that Sam had built continued to serve as a meeting place between communities for generations after his death. Little Star, now a grandmother herself, maintained the traditions that Sam had helped establish, ensuring that the annual trade fairs continued and that the lessons of cooperation and mutual respect were passed down to new generations. But perhaps the most lasting tribute to Sam's legacy was the number of similar relationships that developed throughout the West as his story spread. Newspapers carried accounts of the rancher who had given his last blanket to a Native American child and had been rewarded with friendship that transformed an entire region. The story inspired other settlers to reconsider their attitudes toward Native Americans and encouraged tribal leaders to believe that peaceful coexistence with whites might be possible. Today, visitors to the Dakota Territory can still see the site where Sam's ranch once stood, now marked by a monument that tells the story of Winter Wolf and the night he chose compassion over survival. The monument was erected jointly by descendants of both white settlers and Lakota families, a fitting tribute to a man who proved that the deepest divides between people can be bridged by simple acts of human kindness. The blue wool blanket that started it all is now displayed in the Smithsonian Institution, part of an exhibit about cross-cultural cooperation in the American West. Next to it is a placard that reads, "Sometimes the greatest gifts are those we give when we have nothing left to give." This blanket represents the power of sacrifice to transform not just individual lives, but entire communities. The story of Samuel Henderson and Little Star remains one of the most powerful examples of how individual choices can have consequences that extend far beyond anything we might imagine. It reminds us that even in our darkest moments, we have the power to choose hope over despair, connection over isolation, and love over fear. And sometimes when we give away the last thing we have, we discover that we receive back more than we ever dreamed possible.